is Rudeus Greyrat, a man who reincarnated into a fantasy world, given a second chance at life, and seemingly decided, okay, but what if I made the exact same mistakes again, except now I have magic. Welcome to Diddy Tensei, the Rudeus Greyrat Iceberg. At the top of the iceberg, we have the things that basically everyone knows about Rudeus. As we go deeper, we get into the stuff that the anime either glosses over, changes, or leaves out entirely. And at the bottom, we have the uncomfortable implications of a man who died as a 34-year-old shut-in and was then reborn as a baby while keeping all of his memories. Because the more you think about the premise of Mushoku Tensei, the more you start realizing that Rudeus wasn't actually born again as an innocent child. He was born again as Rudeus Greyrat, but mentally, that's a more complicated question. So let's start at the top. Level 1, the NEET. Before Rudeus was a powerful mage, a father, a husband, but one of the most important characters in Mushoku Tensei, he was a 34-year-old unemployed shut-in. And I don't mean he was just socially awkward. Rudeus had completely abandoned his life. He stopped going to school, he stopped working, he stopped leaving the house, and eventually his family threw him out. At this point, his life had essentially become a cycle of staying inside, consuming porn, and wasting time on the internet. His family tried to intervene, and Rudeus responded by refusing to change. This is one of the most important parts of this character because Rudeus doesn't just begin his story as some misunderstood genius who is secretly a good person. He was genuinely pathetic, and the story makes that very clear. The reason he eventually gets reincarnated is that in his final moments, he sees a group of high school students about to get hit by a truck. Rudeus decides to save them, and this is one of the first genuinely positive things he does in his entire life. Fortunately or unfortunately, he gets hit by the truck himself. Classic anime. Classic truck-kun. And after dying, he's reincarnated into the world of Mushoku Tensei as Rudeus Greyrat. But this is where things immediately get weird. Because unlike most reincarnation stories, Rudeus doesn't forget his previous life. He remembers everything. Every single thing. He remembers being 34 years old. He remembers his family. He remembers his failures. He remembers the internet. And he remembers all of the things he did before dying. So when Rudeus was born, he is technically a baby, but mentally, he's still the same person who just died. And that brings us to the next layer. Level 2, adult mind, child body. This is probably the single biggest reason people are uncomfortable with Rudeus. Because Rudeus is physically a child, but mentally he's not. From the moment he is born, he is capable of thinking like an adult. He can analyze situations, he can understand conversations, he can remember his previous life. And he is fully aware that the people around him see him as a baby. But Rudeus knows the truth. He knows he is not actually mentally newborn, and this creates an extremely uncomfortable situation. Because while Rudeus is growing up physically, he is also experiencing a second childhood with the mind of a grown man. This means that Rudeus is around other children. He does not necessarily see them the same way they see him. To them, he's just another kid, but Rudeus is not just another kid. And the story constantly plays on this idea. Sometimes it's used for comedy, sometimes it's used to show how strange his situation is, and sometimes it becomes extremely uncomfortable. Because technically, Rudeus is a child, but mentally, he's an adult. And technically, the people around him are children. But Rudeus has an adult's memories and experiences. The story wants you to constantly remember that. And honestly, it is one of the most bizarre reincarnation premises in anime because Rudeus doesn't get a clean slate. He gets a new body, but he brings his entire old personality with him. And that leads to one of the most important questions in the entire series. Was Rudeus actually reborn? Or did a 34-year-old man simply get put inside the body of a baby? Level 3, the panties. Now we get to the stuff that most people immediately associate with Rudeus, the panties. Specifically, Roxy's panties. Rudeus is trained by Roxy Megurdia during his childhood, and Roxy becomes one of the most important people in his life. She teaches him magic, she gives him confidence, and she becomes the first person to genuinely help him move forward after the trauma of his previous life. Rudeus develops a huge amount of respect and admiration for her, but because this is Rudeus we're talking about, the admiration becomes incredibly weird. After Roxy leaves, Rudeus keeps her underwear, and not just as some random souvenir, he treats it like a sacred artifact. He stores them, he worships them, and he basically turns a pair of underwear into a religious relic. At one point, the panties are literally placed in a shrine, and Rudeus treats them with an amount of reverence that would be excessive even for a magical sword. But this is one of those moments where Mushoku Tensei tells you, yes, Rudeus is trying to improve as a person, and then immediately follows it up with, also, he has a shrine dedicated to his teacher's underwear. This is one of the reasons people struggle with his character, because Rudeus is capable of genuinely caring about people, he's capable of loyalty, he's capable of bravery, he's capable of risking his life for others, but he also does things that make you want to pause the episode and ask, why? Like, why, dude? And unfortunately, the underwear situation gets even worse, because Rudeus doesn't just have Roxy's underwear, he also has a habit of taking other people's underwear, especially Eris's, which brings us to the next level. Level 4. The infamous video. Now we get to the first genuinely disturbing part of Rudeus's past life. And this is where the anime leaves out one of the most important details about what happened before Rudeus was reincarnated. The anime tells us that Rudeus was a shut-in. He was bullied. He stopped going to school, he isolated himself from society, and eventually his family kicked him out of the house. But the original web novel goes into much more detail about what Rudeus was doing immediately before his death. And this is where things get extremely uncomfortable. In the original version of the story, Rudeus was watching a video involving his nieces. And no, unfortunately, this is not some random fan theory. This is part of the infamous material surrounding his previous life. The exact details have changed depending on the version of the story being discussed, which is why you'll sometimes see people argue over what exactly happened. But the important part is that the story makes it clear that Rudeus reached a point where his behavior had become genuinely disturbing. He wasn't simply sitting in his room watching normal anime, he wasn't just playing video games all day. The material deliberately showing us that Rudeus's previous life had gone far beyond ordinary laziness and social awkwardness. And this is one of the reasons the beginning Mushoku Tensei is so controversial, because Rudeus is not introduced as a morally good person who is simply misunderstood. The story wants you to understand that he was a deeply damaged person who had also made genuinely disgusting choices. And then, immediately after this, he dies. He sees a group of students about to be hit by a truck, and for the first time in what may be decades, Rudeus does something selfless. He tries to save them, and he dies. This is the moment that leads to his reincarnation, and there's something extremely important about the way that this is written. Rudeus does not die after becoming a better person. He does not spend years trying to fix his life. He does not apologize to everyone he hurt. He doesn't even really understand how badly he has failed. He dies at the absolute bottom, and then he is given another life, which means the entire story becomes a question of whether a person can become better after doing things that simply cannot be undone. Because Rudeus doesn't get a clean slate. He gets a new life while remembering everything he did in the old one. And that is much more complicated. Level 5. He wasn't just bullied. The next level is something that a lot of people simplify. Rudeus was bullied. Everyone knows that. But the actual importance of his bullying is much deeper than Rudeus got bullied, so he became a shut-in. The event that destroyed Rudeus's life was not just ordinary teasing. He was beaten and publicly humiliated. And after that, Rudeus essentially stopped participating in society. He stopped going to school, he stopped trying to build a future, and eventually he became completely dependent on staying inside of his room for years, and then more years, and then even more years. Rudeus spent roughly 2 decades allowing his life to deteriorate. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of time. Imagine being 14 years old and thinking, I'll fix my life next year. Then the next year comes and you still don't. Then another year passes, and another, and eventually you're 34 years old and you are still living inside the same failure you never escaped from. That is the real horror of Rudeus's previous life. It isn't just that something terrible happened to him, it's that he allowed the event to become the explanation for everything that happened afterward. The bullying explains why he was traumatized, it explains why he became isolated, but it doesn't explain every terrible decision he made after that. And this is one of the most important things about Rudeus's character. Mushoku Tensei does not give him a simple backstory where he's completely innocent. Rudeus was hurt, but he also hurt other people. He was a victim, but he also made terrible choices. He was traumatized, but trauma does not automatically make every action afterward acceptable. And this is why his second life is not simply a reward. Rudeus is not reincarnated because he was secretly a good person. He's reincarnated because he died. And then he gets the opportunity to become someone different. But having a second chance and deserving a second chance are two completely different things. And for a long time, Rudeus doesn't even realize how much of his old personality he has brought with him. He thinks his new life has made him completely different, but the truth is that the old Rudeus is still there. The only difference is that now he has a new body. a new world, and far more opportunities to either become better or become worse. Level 6. The knowledge from his old world is mostly useless. This is where we start moving away from the obvious degeneracy and into something that is actually important to the world of Mushoku Tensei. Rudeus is incredibly intelligent, but people sometimes treat him like he was reincarnated with a complete knowledge of the modern world. He wasn't. Rudeus remembers his previous life, but his memories are not the same thing as having a perfect database of everything he ever knew. He isn't a scientist with access to every invention. He isn't a historian who memorized every event. He isn't a genius who can recreate modern technology from scratch. And most importantly, almost everything he knows is useless. Rudeus knows what computers are. There are no computers. He knows what cars are. There are no cars. He understands modern concepts, but he doesn't have the industrial infrastructure, materials, tools, or knowledge required to recreate most of them. So Rudeus is placed in an extremely strange position. He is technology advanced compared to the people around him, but he is also completely ignorant about the world he now lives in. He doesn't know how the magic system works. He doesn't know the history of the world. He doesn't know the real nature of the 7 great powers. He doesn't even know the truth about the man god. He does not know what is going to happen in the future. And he doesn't even know the full story of his own reincarnation. This is important because Rudeus' greatest advantage is not that he knows everything. It's that he knows how to learn. He's able to look at magic and ask questions that people born in this world didn't think to ask. He's able to combine different types of magic. He can cast spells without incantation, and he can experiment because he isn't limited by the traditions that other magicians grew up with. Rudeus is powerful because he is an outsider. He sees the world completely differently from everyone else. But being an outsider also makes him vulnerable, because while Rudeus knows things that the people around him don't, the people around him knows things that Rudeus does not. And that becomes extremely important later, because the more powerful Rudeus becomes, the more confident he becomes in his own ability to understand situations. And sometimes that confidence is completely misplaced. Rudeus may be the smartest person in the room, but he doesn't always know who built the room. Level 7. The light novel made his past even worse. One of the biggest misconceptions about Rudeus' past is that the anime simply showed us everything important. Well, it didn't. The anime gives us a basic version. Rudeus is a 34-year-old shut-in who was bullied, dropped out of school, isolated himself from society, and eventually became a complete NEET. But the light novels add some details that makes his past significantly more disturbing. For example, the anime shows Rudeus being thrown out of his house and refusing to leave his room. But the light novels go into way more detail about why he became this way in the first place. When Rudeus was in high school, he was severely bullied after standing up to an upperclassman. He was beaten, stripped naked, photographed, and humiliated. And this wasn't a single embarrassing incident that he eventually got over. It completely destroyed his ability to function normally. Rudeus became so traumatized by what happened that he essentially stopped living. He spent most of his years inside of his room, completely detached from society. And this is where the light novel gives us a much clearer picture of how much time he actually wasted. Rudeus didn't spend a few months as a shut-in. He spent roughly 2 decades allowing his life to completely deteriorate. The anime gives you the image of a pathetic shut-in. The novels make it clear that this wasn't just laziness. This was a person who had allowed himself to become completely disconnected from reality. And then there is a detail that is arguably the most infamous part of his life. In the original web novel, the material was even more explicit about the kind of material Rudeus was consuming before his death. Later versions of the story altered or clarified some of the details, but the important part is that the series was deliberately showing us that Rudeus' past wasn't simply he was bullied, therefore he became a shut-in. He was bullied, he was traumatized, but he also made years of incredibly terrible choices after that. The story does not present him as a completely innocent victim, and that's the distinction the anime sometimes makes easier to miss. But one of the biggest differences between the anime and the light novel isn't actually a single deleted perversion. It's how much access we have to Rudeus' thoughts. The light novel is constantly inside Rudeus' head. You get his impulses, rationales, his shame, his self-awareness, and sometimes his complete lack of self-control. The anime has to show this visually, so a complicated internal monologue can become a single reaction shot. A paragraph of Rudeus realizing that he has just crossed a line can become a joke, and an entire argument he has with himself can become one facial expression. That changes how he comes across. The anime can make Rudeus look like a perverted teenager who says weird things. The novel makes it much harder to forget that this is a person carrying the memories and psychological baggage of an entire previous life. And then there is an even more important difference. The light novel novel doesn't just give us more Rudeus, it gives us more perspectives on people around him. We get chapters from characters like Paul, Eris, Sylphie, and others, so the story can show you what people think about Rudeus when he isn't around. That matters because Rudeus is not always a reliable judge of his own character. He can convince himself that he's being clever, he can rationalize something as a joke, he can tell himself that his intentions are good, but another character's perspective can make it obvious that Rudeus is being selfish, manipulative, or simply acting like a complete idiot. So the light novel's biggest advantage isn't just that it has more degenerate Rudeus moments, it gives you a much more complete picture of the person behind them. And sometimes that picture is a lot worse. Sometimes it's much more sympathetic, and sometimes it's both at the same time. Level 8. The man god was already playing the game. For a long time, Rudeus believes that his reincarnation is basically a second chance. He died. He was born again, and now he gets to live properly. But as the story progresses, we learn that Rudeus's new life is not nearly as random as he originally believes, because there is someone who has been influencing the events of his life from the shadows. The man god. At first, the man god seems helpful. He appears in Rudeus's dreams, he gives him advice, he tells him where to go, he tells him who to trust, and a lot of the time, his advice works. This is what makes the man god so dangerous. If he were obviously evil from the beginning, Rudeus would never listen to him. But the man god gives advice that is useful. He helps Rudeus survive, he gives him information that he couldn't otherwise obtain. And because Rudeus has already lived one complete miserable life, he desperately wants to believe that someone is actually finally helping him. But the problem is that Rudeus doesn't know what the man god actually wants. And this is where the entire relationship becomes terrifying. Rudeus is making life-changing decisions based on advice from a being he barely understands. He doesn't know the man god's true goals. He doesn't know what the man god has done in the past. He doesn't know what will happen if he refuses to listen. And yet, every time the man god's advice works, Rudeus trusts him a little bit more. This creates one of the most dangerous situations in the series, because Rudeus is not being controlled through force. He's being manipulated through results. The man god tells him to do something, Rudeus does it. Something good happens, so Rudeus thinks the man god helped me. But that doesn't necessarily mean the man god was helping Rudeus. It could simply mean that Rudeus's success happened to benefit the man god too. And eventually, Rudeus is forced to confront the fact that the person he has trusted for so long may have actually been using him since the beginning. The irony is incredible. Rudeus was given a second life because he wanted to escape the mistakes of this first, but he spends part of that life being manipulated by someone who knows far more about his situation than he does. He thinks he is finally controlling his own destiny, but someone else may have been moving the pieces the entire time. Level 9. The future Rudeus. This is one of the biggest revelations in the entire Mushoku Tensei story, because eventually, Rudeus encounters information about a version of himself who lived a completely different life. And this version of Rudeus is one of the most important characters in the entire story. Future Rudeus is what happens when the path of Rudeus's life goes horribly wrong. He loses people. He makes different decisions. He becomes consumed by grief and revenge, and eventually he becomes a completely different person. This is important because future Rudeus proves something terrifying. Rudeus is not guaranteed to become the person we see in the main story. There is no magical force ensuring that he becomes a good person. There is no destiny forcing him to stay and build a family. There is no guarantee that he will overcome his trauma. The Rudeus we follow is only one possible version of Rudeus, and there are other paths, much darker paths. Future Rudeus is essentially a warning. He shows what happens when the worst parts of Rudeus are allowed to grow without being stopped. The selfishness, the obsession, the trauma, the inability to let go, desperation to change the past. All of those things can eventually consume him. And this completely changes the way you look at Rudeus. Because when you watch the main story, you might think Rudeus is becoming a better person because that's just who he is now. But future Rudeus proves that isn't true. He could have become something much worse. The people Rudeus meets matter. The relationships he forms matter. The decisions he makes matter. And the small differences between one path and another can completely change the person he becomes. This is one of the reasons future Rudeus is so important. He is not just an alternate version of the protagonist, he is proof that Rudeus's redemption is not guaranteed. The person we follow is not special because he was destined to become good, he is special because at certain points in his life, he makes different choices. And sometimes, the difference between becoming a loving father and becoming a completely broken man is one decision. Level 10. The reason Rudeus is so powerful. powerful. Most people know Rudeus is a powerful mage, but his strength is much more than simply he has a lot of mana. Rudeus's abilities are the result of several different advantages coming together. First, he has an enormous amount of mana. This is largely connected to the way he was born and trained. Unlike most children, Rudeus begins practicing magic extremely early. He spends years training before most people even begin seriously learning magic. He also has the ability to cast magic without chanting, and this gives him an enormous advantage in combat. But the most important thing about Rudeus is that he does not think about magic the same way everyone else does. Most people in the world learn magic through established systems. They learn the incantation, they produce the spell, and they repeat the process. Rudeus looks at the system and asks, why? Why does the spell need to be cast this way? Why does the magic have to take this shape? What if he changes the amount of mana? What if he changes the form? What happens if he combines different types of magic? This is why Rudeus is able to develop techniques that other people don't think of. His greatest strength is not simply having more mana, it is that he treats magic like a system that can be experimented with. He is constantly testing the limits, and that mindset comes directly from being an outsider. Rudeus is not trapped by the assumption that magic has to work the way everyone else says it does. However, this also creates one of the biggest weaknesses in his character. Rudeus is incredibly powerful at range, but he is not automatically the strongest person in the world. There are swordsmen who can kill him before he has time to cast a spell. There are monsters who can survive attacks that would destroy ordinary people. There are people whose combat abilities are simply beyond anything Rudeus can handle directly. So Rudeus' strength is not he can beat anyone. His strength is that he is one of the most dangerous people in the world if he has time to prepare. And this is the important distinction. Rudeus is not a god. He is a terrifyingly powerful human being. And sometimes the difference between those two things is the only reason he survives. Level 11, the family that saved Rudeus. One of the most important things about Rudeus' second life is something that is easy to overlook. His family is what ultimately gives him a reason to keep living. Rudeus' first life was defined by isolation. He had no meaningful future, he had no real relationships, and eventually he stopped believing that his life was worth anything. His second life begins very differently. He has parents, he has teachers, he has friends, he has siblings, and eventually he builds his own family. This is not just a side effect of the story, it is the entire foundation of Rudeus' development. Paul is one of the first people to force Rudeus to confront the fact that he is not the only person in the world who is suffering. Zenith gives him a family connection that he has never had in his previous life. Sylphie gives him a relationship built on trust. Roxy gives him a sense of direction. Eris forces him to become stronger. And later, his children give him something that he never had before, a responsibility that he cannot simply run away from. This is why Rudeus changes. Not because someone gives him a speech, not because he suddenly decides, I will now be a good person. He changes because he finally has people he cannot bear to lose. And this is one of the biggest contrasts between his two lives. In his first life, Rudeus loses everything and retreats from the world. In his second life, Rudeus loses people and goes looking for them. That difference is enormous. The same person who once refused to leave his room eventually crosses continents to find his family. He risks his life. He fights monsters. He confronts people far stronger than himself. And he does all of that because he finally has something worth protecting. This is probably the most important part of Rudeus' redemption. He doesn't become a better person because he suddenly becomes less selfish. He becomes a better person because his selfishness finally becomes connected to other people. He wants to live, but now he wants other people to live too. And that is the real transformation. Level 12, the reincarnation wasn't random. Now we reach a level where the entire premise of Rudeus' story begins to look completely different. For most of his life, Rudeus assumes that his reincarnation was random. He died, he was reborn, and now he has a second chance. But the deeper we go into the story, the harder it becomes to believe that his existence is just a coincidence. Rudeus' arrival in this world is connected to the larger conflict surrounding the man god. His reincarnation is connected to events that began longer before he was even born, and his existence eventually becomes incredibly important to the future of the world. This means that Rudeus' second life may not simply be a bad person gets a second chance, it may also be a person is born into a world because his existence is necessary for a conflict he doesn't even understand. And that is a much darker premise, because Rudeus spends his entire life believing that he is finally free to make his own choices. But what if his very existence was part of a larger plan? What if he was brought into this world because someone needed him? What if the people manipulating his life understood his purpose before he did. Rudeus spends years trying to escape the mistakes of his previous life, but he never realizes that his second life may also have been shaped by forces beyond his control. He is not the chosen hero. He is not given a prophecy. He is not told, you were reincarnated for this specific reason. He simply dropped into the world, and then slowly he becomes involved in conflicts that are much older than he is. The deeper Rudeus goes, the more he realizes that his life is connected to events he had no part in creating, and eventually he has to decide whether he is going to continue following the path that has been placed in front of him, or whether he is finally going to make his own. Level 13. The world was moving before Rudeus was even born, and this is where I think the Rudeus Greyrat Iceberg truly reaches the bottom. Rudeus is the protagonist of Mushoku Tensei, but he is not the most important person in the world. He's not the strongest, and he's not the most knowledgeable, and he's not the person who understands the true history of the world, and he is not even the person who fully understands what is happening to him. For most of the story, Rudeus is essentially an extremely intelligent person trying to navigate a world that is much bigger than he realizes. He is born into a world with thousands of years of history. He becomes involved in conflicts that began before he was born. He's manipulated by people who understand things that he doesn't. He encounters individuals who are far stronger than he ever will be. And despite all of his knowledge from his previous life, Rudeus is still fundamentally ignorant about the world that actually matters. He thinks he is living his second life, but he doesn't understand the game. He thinks he is making his own decisions. People are constantly trying to influence those decisions. He thinks he is building a peaceful life, but he's standing in the middle of conflicts involving beings that have existed for centuries. And that is what makes this entire story so interesting. The surface level version of Rudeus is simple. He's a perverted shut-in who gets reincarnated into a fantasy world. The deeper version is far more complicated. He is a traumatized man who was given the second life. He brings his failures with him. He brings his memories with him, and he brings his personality with him. But he's also placed in a completely different world. A world where his previous knowledge is only partially useful. A world where his choices affect people he never would have met before. A world where he can become a hero, a villain, a father, a husband, or a completely broken version of himself. And the most disturbing part is that there is no guarantee that he becomes the person we know. The Rudeus we follow is the result of thousands of decisions. Some of them good, some of them horrible. Some of them made because he wanted to help people. Some of them made because he was selfish. And some of them made because he had no idea who he was actually trusting. So when you look at the entire Rudeus Greyrat Iceberg, the funniest part is that the Diddy jokes are actually only the surface. Yes, he has the underwear allegations. Yes, he has the pervert allegations. Yes, he has the 3-wife allegations. And yes, he has the cheating allegations. The allegations are extensive, but the actual bottom of the iceberg is much stranger, because the real story of Rudeus is not simply a degenerate who gets reincarnated. It is the story of a man who has already lived one entire life, failed completely, and then was given another one. But this second life does not erase the first. He still remembers the person he was, and he still carries the trauma, shame, and all the disgusting parts of his personality. And he has to become a better person while carrying all of that with him. And then, just when he starts believing that he finally understands his new life, he discovers that he may have been part of a much larger plan from the beginning. The man who thought he was finally escaping his past may have been walking into the future designed by someone else. The man who thought he was controlling his destiny may have been manipulated by someone who understood the world far better than he did. And the man who thought he was the main character is living in a world where he is just one piece on the board. So how bad is Rudeus? Well, he's a 34-year-old shut-in who reincarnated with all his memories, who has done some genuinely disgusting things, has made terrible decisions, who has cheated, has acted like a complete degenerate, who has spent an embarrassing amount of time around underwear. And if this were any other character, that would probably be the end of the discussion. But Rudeus is an interesting case because the story doesn't ask, was he always secretly a good person? The answer is no. He wasn't. The story asks something much more uncomfortable. Can someone who wasted an entire life become a person better in the next one? Can they become better without erasing the horrible things they did? Can a second life actually change someone? Or does it just give the same person a new opportunity to make different mistakes? And that's why Rudeus is one of the most controversial protagonists in anime, because you are never allowed to completely forget who he was. Even when he becomes powerful, you remember the shut-in. Even when he becomes a father, you remember that he's a pervert. And when he saves people, you remember the things he did before. But at the same time, you also watch him change. You watch him become someone who protects people, someone who builds relationships, and who risks his life for others. Someone who finally has a reason to keep moving forward. And maybe that is the real bottom of the Rudeus Greyrat Iceberg. Not that Rudeus is secretly the worst person imaginable, and not that his past should be ignored, but that the story forces you to watch someone become a better person without pretending that they were ever a good person to begin with, which is either a genuinely interesting redemption story or the most elaborate excuse for a degenerate to get 3 wives in anime history. And honestly, it might be both. This has been Diddy Tensei, the Rudeus Greyrat Iceberg. And if you enjoyed watching me descend into the most cursed parts of Mushoku Tensei, subscribe. Because if Rudeus gets a second life, I can probably make a second video about how much worse this rest of the series gets.